Greetings and welcome everyone to the 22nd episode of the Mystery Hour with Con Sweeney, held at noon Second Life time or 3 p.m. Eastern for you folks in real life. Now to what we're about today. We're a monthly show based here in Second Life. We broadcast live from here on Facebook and YouTube every third Monday of the month at 12 p.m. Second Life time or 12 p.m. Pacific time for you folks in real life. We meet mystery authors and others from the publishing world to talk about books and the issues facing them today from social and technological change. And there's certainly a lot of that lately. I'd like to thank Draxler Display, host of the Second Life Book Club and the Drax Files Radio Hour, both broadcast from Second Life, for his sponsorship and the use of the Book Club Island when we first got started. I'd also like to thank Strawberry Linden and Brent Linden for their help in setting this show up. And finally, my eternal thanks to Becky Hansen and Isabel Charon for all their technical assistance in making this happen. Without you, it wouldn't have been possible. Now, our regular viewers may notice that we're no longer on the Book Club Island. The reason being that there's a lot going on over there these days, and setting up for our show was becoming a bit of an effort. So we decided to set up our own studio, and here we are. Now, allow me to introduce today's guest, Amer Anwar, author of the critically acclaimed thrillers Brothers in Blood and Stone Cold Trouble, both based in Southall, West London. I just want to point out to the audience that today both our guest and our crew are all over in the UK, sweltering under a heat wave, so we wish them the best.
Thank you.
Amer is based in London, where his books are also set. Welcome, Amer.
Thank you very much, Con.
Okay. Also, we have another first here today, that Amer is our first guest who actually had his own avatar, courtesy of Drax's show. Becky was very grateful. So, how does it feel to be back in Second Life again, Amer?
Very good. Great to be back. I'm not here enough, but when I have a good reason like this, then it's great to visit.
Well, we're certainly glad to have you back, and maybe you could tell us a bit about yourself, your journey as a writer, what motivated you to write, and what life has been like for you as a writer during the pandemic.
Wow, that's a big topic, but
go ahead. We got time.
Yeah, great. One I'm happy to talk about. Okay, so for me, as a kid, I started off as a huge reader, and at a really quite a young age, about sort of 9 or 10, I got into adult fiction, and at first it was through horror novels. And so I was reading a British crime author called James Herbert, and then obviously, like many people, got into Stephen King.
I know James Herbert very well. When I used to live in London, he was still alive, still publishing. I loved his books.
Yeah, same here. But as a sort of impressionable 10-year-old, they scared the hell out of me.
I was a lot older than 10, and they scared the hell out of me.
Great. So I started reading those, and for me, I think it was just the sheer sort of thrill of it. I mean, I used to like watching horror movies, the old sort of black and white RKO stuff, and I think I just liked being kind of thrilled and chilled and scared. And those books just really did it, because I was too young to go to the cinema to see all the horror films that were coming out, and I would see the ads and think, wow, I'd love to see that, even though it was like scary. But the books, nobody stopped you going into a bookshop and buying the book. And I still remember wanting to see the original Alien movie, which I was too young for. But I went into the local bookshop and I bought the novelization, and I read that. And so I had everything in it, probably even more detail than the fleeting sort of scenes and edits on the screen. So that really sort of hooked me as a reader. And then over the years, I got into reading like Second World War novels, and then fantasy and science fiction. And one of those fantasy books, actually, it was Magician by Raymond E. Feist.
Mm-hmm.
And I read that book, and when I finished it, I just thought, wow, what an amazing journey this author has taken me on. And it's just one person sitting in an office typing words onto paper, and yet it's made me experience so many different things. And that book had so many different facets to it. There was like love, war, politics, dragons, romance, all sorts of things. And I remember finishing that book thinking, gosh, I'd love to be able to do that. And I think that stuck with me. I think when I read that book when I was about 15 or so, and that stuck with me. I always had that thing in the back of my mind that I'd love to write someday, and I didn't know when that day would be. So it was many years later, I started reading crime novels. And I think the first author I read that got me into crime was Elmore Leonard. And I'm a huge Elmore Leonard fan. And I just love the way he writes. But then that got me into reading other authors. And I think the one that really sort of crystallized what I was hoping to do was reading Devil in a Blue Dress by Walter Mosley. Because I'm from a South Asian background, and most of the books I was reading had white characters as the main characters, and I hadn't seen any colors of characters of color in any of the books that I'd been reading up until that point. But with Devil in a Blue Dress, Walter Mosley had Easy Rawlins front and center, the main character, not a cop, not a conventional detective, but he's sort of sucked into this mystery that he has to solve, and it's set in 40s LA and predominantly in the black part of LA. And so that really resonated with me because I live very near a large South Asian community in London, and I'd sort of spent a lot of my formative years there, sort of, you know, going to pubs and hanging out with friends and hearing all these stories about what different young men were getting up to, like, you know, some of it definitely illegal stuff, some legal, some funny, some, you know, horrendous sort of stories. But it was the area was just ripe with these characters and stories. And reading Devil in a Blue Dress just sort of struck a spark with me, and I just thought, well, if Walter Mosley can do that with 1940s LA, why couldn't I do that with contemporary West London? And that sort of sowed the seed. But really at that point I was thinking in terms of, I would love a book like that, somebody should write it. And I never thought I would be the one to write it, and I was sort of waiting, and then so I think gradually over the years I started to just, you know, think up a character, and then I read a story about a real life crime that happened in the area, and I just thought, wow, I could use that and put my character into a story with that event happening. And then it all started to sort of form slowly, and it was in the back of my mind, but I never thought I could write it because I just didn't see writers from a background like mine. So, you know, very working class, single parent family. I didn't go to university, and, you know, I just thought, well, you know, writing is something quite lofty, and you have all these sort of like very academic people who write novels. That was the impression I had back then. So fast forward 20 years, I was working in graphics, I work in sort of packaging, and I was doing DVD design. So I worked on the UK covers for things like Captain America and James Bond and stuff like that. And this was just when the sort of internet was really taking off, and lots of designers were saying it would be really useful to get into web design. So I started doing some evening courses to learn coding, basic sort of HTML and CSS. And I did a couple of courses, and then they finished, and I was looking for another course to do. And I happened to find one that was an introduction to writing fiction. I thought, well, you know, I've always fancied this, I should give it a go. So I took that course. It was about 5 months, just you know, one evening, I think, a week. And I started writing sort of short stories, and I really enjoyed it. And once I finished that course, I thought, okay, now I can try and write this novel that's been sort of bubbling away in the mind. And I tried writing it, and it was terrible. Like, when I read it back, I was like, this is really not the sort of standard I was hoping for. So I realized I needed to obviously improve and learn more about writing and being a writer and the techniques and stuff. So then I took a 2-year graduate level course in creative writing, and then that led to an MA, which I guess is the equivalent of an MFA in America. And so I did the MA, and while I was doing those writing courses, I wrote the first chapter of what would become Brothers in Blood. And I knew that on the road on the way to getting published, there's loads of rejections. You need to get used to that whole process. So I figured I finally had this chapter, and I'd heard of a competition run by the Crime Writers Association in the UK, and it's called the Debut Dagger for the best sort of unpublished novel. And so I entered. You only have to enter like the first 3,000 words of your book. So I entered the first chapter, really hoping just to get my first rejection, and then so I could build up a thicker skin and get used to the whole process. But I ended up winning the award, and which was a complete shock to me. And then that got me an agent, and then that led to me, interest in the book. So then I went on to write the book, and it struggled. It didn't find a publisher. It was rejected originally by every publisher it went to, because they didn't know what to do with a mainly South Asian set book, because all the characters are South Asian, the setting South Asian, although it's very British as well. That's the funny thing, because I was born in England, and my whole background is sort of growing up here, and so have all my friends. And so it was a kind of, I guess it was, I don't think of it as niche, but I think perhaps the publishers thought of it as being quite niche, and they didn't think it would sell. And I kind of disagreed with that, and I think because I'd won the award, I had an agent who believed in it, and my agent is the same agent as some of the best-selling crime writers in the UK. So I would guess that she knows what she's talking about, and she was very much behind the book. So in the end, I decided to self-publish just to get it out to readers and get like a real kind of response to it. And me being I'm wanting to do things properly and having a background in sort of art and design, I basically set up a fake publishing company, and being a designer, I designed a logo for the company. I learned how to format for ebook. I learned how to typeset for paperbacks, and then I got in touch with the printing company that prints for all the big publishers over here, and they were happy to print the book for me. So I got my paperbacks printed, and then I had my ISBN number and everything, and I had a fake office address in central London and all sorts. And
I love this.
Yeah, and when Clays had printed the books, because they print for so many of the big companies, they deal directly with the biggest book wholesaler in the UK. And they said, would you like an account with Gardner's? And I said, well, yeah, because I knew I would have to go through the process if I wanted to get the book into bookstores, because I could get it onto Amazon and Apple and Kobo, which is what I did for the ebook. But getting into bookstores is, I don't know, I guess it kind of feels more like a legitimate book if you see it in a bookstore.
Yeah, a lot of authors, say the same thing.
And I think my background, all my books, I don't read ebooks generally. All my books are paperbacks, because that's what I grew up with. That's what I could afford. So for me, I really wanted to get a paperback in a bookshop. So I got an account with Gardner's, and then I wrote to Waterstones, who's the biggest book chain in the UK.
No.
And and I sent them a press release from this fake publishing company, and from the fake marketing person. It was all me. And I just, I told them about the book. They came back. Obviously, they'd never heard of the publisher, they'd never heard of the author, they'd never heard of the book. So they weren't going to take it on as core stock. And so core stock would have been where they buy a few thousand copies and they send it to every bookstore. And that's what they do with all the big bestsellers and stuff. But what they did say is, well, you're on the system at Gardner's, so any shop that wants to can order it. So that got me, I visited every Waterstones in London that I could reach, and I took a copy of the book with me, and I asked to speak to the manager, and I sort of told them about the book and that it won the award, and they were, oh, okay, that sounds really interesting. And they looked it up, and they saw it was on the system, and they said, okay, we'll give it a go. We'll order 10 copies or 15 copies. So that seemed to work for the shops I could reach, but there was loads of stores around the country that I couldn't get to. So their email addresses are on the Waterstones website. So then I was emailing all the stores that I thought the book would appeal to, and I sent them a press release and like a PDF of the press release, and told them about the book and stuff like that. And then, you know, the readers up in Scotland, in Wales, and all over the country were starting to read the book, and I was getting like really good reviews on Amazon, and it was going. I felt it was going really well, and all the feedback was really positive. So everything that the publisher had kind of been worried about didn't turn out to be true, because most of the readers were the demographic that the publishers were worried wouldn't connect with the book, and they so did, because I started to get lots of messages from them. Anyway, I was hustling the book around any chance I could get. So any literary events, crime writing events I would go to, and try and foist copies onto authors, because I figured if, you know, if a big name author read it and liked it, perhaps they would tweet about it, and that would, you know, just be sort of like great publicity for the book. And then at one event, I'd given out the 2 or 3 copies of the book I had with me, and I was introduced to Charmaine Lovegrove, who just started a new imprint at Little Brown in the UK. And so I told her about the book, and she was really interested, because she was looking for books just like that for the imprint. And she called me in for a meeting, so I talked to her, and then about 5 days later, she offered me a publishing deal, and I signed with them for 2 books, the 2 books that we're talking about today.
Very good. Very good. That is a great story there. You're hitting on so many issues that so many writers are talking about, whether it's over in the UK where you live or over here in the United States.
Yeah.
You know, Walter Mosley, while I've never met him, he's a member of the Mystery Writers of America, and I'm on the board of directors of the New York chapter. And I know he was a co-founder of Crime Writers of Color, which we'll talk about more in a moment. But Devil in a Blue Dress was like the novel, the mystery that made him. Didn't hurt that Bill Clinton picked it up and was reading it too back in the day. But you know, for the folks I know who have met him, they love the man. They love his writing. I love his writing. And you know, it's interesting how, you know, you said that, you know, your book may have been perceived by some as a niche book because it was appealing to a certain community. But what I'm seeing is that these barriers to niche books are moving away, especially over here in the States, where despite some of all the craziness that's going on here, it's still a very, you know, when it comes to reading, it's still very open. People want to read the stories by Walter Mosley. They want to read the stories by, you know, guys like you. You know, we've had several Asian American authors on who have been promoting their books, African American. It's getting more diverse, which is wonderful, because you get to see, you know, these books take you inside communities, into life, and you know, you see things differently than when you get an all-white group of authors, all white older males writing the stories. You know, they all can't. You know, Sherlock Holmes and Sam Spade, they're nice stories, good, but let's get something a little bit more contemporary, and that's what you and many of the others are doing here right now for us.
Yeah, thank you. And I think one of the whole sort of things about reading is that it takes you outside of yourself.
Yes.
And you can experience things that you would not otherwise do. So if you're reading the sort of, you know, something that's quite similar to your own experience, then, you know, you could be doing so much more through the reading experience. And I think, you know, this is why sort of fantasy books do so well, because they take the readers to like completely different worlds.
Oh yeah. Yes.
And so readers really kind of love that. And I think within crime fiction as well, that's starting to happen, because I've seen, like, there's been such a sort of rise in Scandi noir. So, you know, crime novels from Scandinavia, from sort of Sweden and Iceland and places like that. And that's really big. And that's, you know, it's quite different to what readers are sort of used to reading, you know, sort of mysteries set in the UK and stuff. And also, like, now there's a big sort of thing for novels set in Australia, crime novels, and New Zealand, and that seems to be like a real kind of on the upswing. But there again, it's taking people away from what they know, what they feel comfortable with, and they're experiencing things from other places and cultures around the world. And I think even though my book's set in London, I think it's a community and a part of London that a lot of people won't know. And I think, you know, by picking up a book and reading it, you know, you get a feel of that sort of community and stuff. Although, you know, maybe not the best sort of feel from reading my books because it's quite dark in places. But, you know, then I think through the main characters, you see that, you know, there's some humor to be had, and there's, you know, great friendships, and there's a lot about it that is actually interesting and appealing, hopefully.
Certainly. Now, Amer, I think I've mentioned to you that I used to live in London about 40 years ago, and Southall, West London seems to have changed a bit since I was there last. Could you tell us a little bit about your choice of the setting and what it's like today?
The choice of the setting was, so I never, a lot of people assume because I've written about Southall like so much in these two books, they kind of assume that I am from Southall, but I'm actually from just down the road in Ealing. And so Southall is a big South Asian community, and it has been for, I think, from about the 1960s, when lots of people from the Indian subcontinent were invited over to the UK to help with jobs, because there was labor shortages and stuff like that. And so, being part of the Commonwealth, they invited Commonwealth citizens over to help in the factories and to work on the buses and London Transport, Post Office, all those kind of big sort of industries and infrastructure things. So a lot of people came over, and, you know, there was difficulties around, people wouldn't rent houses to them and stuff. So, and I think you find this in other communities that happen to the Irish community over here as well. I mean, there's infamous signs that used to say, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs, you know, which is terrible, but that's how it sort of was. So people used to sort of club together and like buy a house together, and then they would all live there, and then they would help other people to buy. And because they couldn't really spread out, and they were sort of safety in numbers thing, they would buy very close to people that they knew. So the community kind of sprang up in that kind of way, and it kind of grew and prospered, and there's like loads of Asian shops, so you can get lots of Asian foods and clothing and records, and they used to have cinemas there which would show films from India, the Bollywood films. So there was a real kind of sense of community that was created around that, and it sort of thrived, and they used to have their festivals and everything. But where I grew up was sort of outside of that, so my experience was very different, because there was very few, like, you could count the people of color in the area that I lived in on the, you know, one hand. So my experience growing up was very different. You know, there was quite a bit of racism and stuff I had to sort of put up with. But that was sort of when I was much younger. When I went to secondary school, my school was in Ealing, and Ealing was sort of part way between where I sort of grew up and where Southall was. So there was quite a few kids from Southall came to that school, and I went to that school, and then I made friends, and I would go and hang out with these friends in Southall on a weekend. And for me, it was a real eye-opener, because, you know, these guys had been through race riots in that area, and there was this big sort of sense of that they would all stick up for themselves and each other, and that was something that was very sort of alien to me, very sort of unheard of, and it just sort of really had a massive impact on me. And I sort of started hanging around with these guys, and then it sort of gave me a bit more pride in who I was and my own background and heritage and stuff like that, because I guess it kind of sort of rubbed off on me, that whole attitude of, you know, yeah, we're proud, we don't care, you know. And so I think that impression sort of stuck with me, and the whole area had such an impression. And as I said before, hearing the stories of the people that lived there, like hanging out with my friends, and you'd hear all these sort of like unbelievable tales of the things that people were getting up to, and these like really colorful characters, and I just thought, wow, that'd be so good in a book. Like, there's so much material here, you know, it'd be ripe for for sort of crime fiction or a thriller or something. And yeah, I was hoping it was something I would have loved to have read, and I was waiting for somebody to do it, and nobody did. And so after all those years, when I got around to writing it, it seemed I was the first person to sort of to do that. But that was the motivation, really, and also because I didn't see characters like my friends and myself in books. And it was like, well, why can't we have our stories told? Why can't characters like us be the center of a novel? And so that was another motivating factor.
That's a wonderful explanation there, Amer. Thank you. In my own family's experience over here in the U.S., and again, very different, but from yours, but similar in certain ways. My mother, who grew up in New York City, Brooklyn, during the World War II period, she told us stories about, signs and windows here that would say, that would have the letters NICNA, which meant no Irish Catholics need apply. It's these certain ignorant behaviors seem to be universals. They go away in time, but it takes what you just described, people banding together, standing up, and like,
Yeah.
hey, we're here, buddy. If you don't like it, move on. The Irish didn't have race riots here, at least not since the Civil War, but they certainly had more than their fair share of bar brawls.
Yeah, I can imagine. But also, then don't some of the best stories come out of those sort of communities?
Oh yeah, it's they always say that writers should write what they know.
Yeah.
And I think that's what you're telling us here right now. And can I ask you a question, please? This one wasn't on the list of questions I sent over you, but how is your community receiving your stories? How do they feel about them?
Well, it's sort of hard. It's kind of hard to gauge because I think most of the people who read the books aren't from that community.
Mm-hmm.
But the ones that are, they love them. I mean, it's had a really positive response from people because I think it's that thing of, oh my gosh, I can't believe somebody has written a book set in this area with characters like us in it. So, and it's not full of stereotypes, and the characters aren't just kind of just there to tick a box. I mean, the whole thrust of the story is to do with these characters and their lives, and they're represented like quite as fully as I was able to do. So I think that has, just seeing an experience like yours and characters like yourself on the page, I mean, that's exactly what I wanted to do, and I think it's had a very positive response just because of that. And that, as a writer, that is so gratifying, that what I wanted in a book, I've been able to sort of produce, and others are sort of experiencing what I'd hoped to experience myself all those years ago. So it feels, if I had a kind of aim for the book, then that seems to have been fulfilled in that. But then, and also, readers who I didn't think the book would appeal to. I mean, I can remember one of the early reviews for the book that I got, and I remember it clearly because it made such an impact on me. And it was this lady had written, and I think it's still on Amazon if anyone wants to sort of check it. I think she wrote, I'm not sure I'm the right target audience for this book because I'm white, I'm 40, I'm female, and I'm Scottish, but I absolutely loved it. And and she went on to say why she loved it. And I had similar responses from other readers who were from outside London. They were from the out in the rural sort of countryside, the really pretty parts of England, and they don't know anything about Southall and the Asian community there or anywhere. And they'd read the book, and I had emails from people saying, wow, we really felt we learned something about this community, and it was so exciting to sort of learn that and feel that we were part of that while reading the book. And that's a brilliant sort of response to get for any author.
Oh, it is. Now, Amer, could you tell us a little, please, about crime writers of color and how it's helped you, and also how did you become aware of it on the other side of the pond, so to speak?
Yeah, so Crime Writers of Color, I hadn't heard of it, and I kind of friends first over Twitter, and then we sort of met in person in London with a crime writer called oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing. I want to get her name right now. You know when you sort of put on the spot.
Oh, I know the feeling, and I didn't mean to do that. So
Yeah,
don't worry.
yeah. So hang on, I'm just going to make sure I get her name right. Osma Zinat Khan, and
Okay.
she's a American Canadian author of crime thrillers and also fantasy novels. But so we met in person. You know, we'd been sort of friends on Twitter, and we met in person. And then she was back in I think she lives in Canada now or Colorado somewhere. I'm not quite sure. She has moved a bit, but she was the one who told me about Crime Writers of Color, and she said suggested that I join. But it's not, you know, you can't just sort of go and join. You have to be invited. So I think she talked to a couple of people and asked, you know, if they would send me an invite. And I was sort of waiting. She said, "Oh, you should get an invitation soon," and I didn't get one. And then so I didn't sort of think anything of it. And then I think there was a report that came out about diversity in publishing, or rather the lack of it. And it was quite an eye opener and stuff. And I think people were talking about it online. And I think Kelly Garrett from
Kelly Garrett, yes.
Yeah, from Crime Writers of Color. I think she posted something, and I responded, and we kind of had a conversation like that. And then very shortly after that, she sent me an invite to join Crime Writers of Color, which I did. And it's a fabulous sort of community and group of, as it's, you know, as you would expect, crime writers of color. I mean, mainly US based, but there are, you know, quite a few from the UK, and I think from further afield as well, from perhaps Singapore and India and places like that. But it's great, just I think, because for a lot of writers of color, you kind of, I know when I started going to literary events, I would often be the only person of color there, and so you often get a feeling of isolation. I mean, I didn't, because I just, it really didn't bother me. I kind of expected it, and you know, I never felt like the odd one out. I just thought, well, I'm here and that's it, deal with it. Not that any look, but to be fair, you know, everyone in the crime writing community is just lovely, so I, you know, never felt out of place or was made to feel uncomfortable or anything. But I think, you know, if you are the only person of color, you do tend to feel that you're kind of isolated and on your own. So just having this sort of forum and this group online lets you know that there's like so many others out there in the same boat, you know, whether they're sort of starting out or they're just published or they've, you know, had a long history of publication, and they're all very supportive and helpful, and they'll sort of, you know, amplify each other's books and stuff like that. So it's just really great to have.
Wonderful. Now, switching to your mysteries for a moment, Amer, can we find you in any of your characters?
I would say, you know, it's going back to that old adage of write what you know. And I think, especially with a debut novel, you will inevitably put some of yourself into your characters. But, you know, I think probably in a much more idealized way, you'll sort of put part of yourself there, and then a lot of elements that you wish were there. Because so Zach Khan, who's my main character, he's an ex-con who's been to prison for a serious crime, and while he was in prison, like, he knew how to fight a little bit, but in prison he got in with the guys who used to do all kinds of mixed martial arts in the prison gym, and he's really learned how to fight very well, and he knows how to look after himself, and he's sort of taller than I am. He's probably a bit better looking than I am, so there's a bit of wish fulfillment there, and you can sort of, you know, and you can just sort of like live vicariously in certain respects through your character and do those things. But yeah, I'm not that tough, I'm not that tall, I'm not that good looking. I would not get into those situations. I've never been to prison, so but yeah, apart from that, I'm sure there's little bits. I mean, I think one of my best friends was reading the book, and he said that he read the book, and when he read it, he just heard my voice in his head all the way through. And I think the humor, because there's quite a bit of humor. The two central characters are two best friends, and they're based on myself, my best friends, and my friends Southall. So there's little bits of quite a lot of people sort of pulled together to create some of these characters. So a lot of people have said that the friendship between the two main characters feels so real and so authentic. And I think it's because it is kind of based on that reality. And when I was writing it, I was always sort of think, well, if I was in that situation, what would I say? What would I do? What would my friends say? How would they interact? How would they sort of start taking the mickey out of each other and you know, trading insults and stuff? So in that respect, there is quite a lot of myself and my friends in the book.
I haven't heard that expression in years, taking the mickey out of someone.
It's very English. I was hoping that you'd understand.
Oh, I know. For our friends in the American audience, that means, you know,
Ribbing.
Yeah, ribbing, teasing.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're bringing back many fond memories for me, Amer.
Great.
Now, my next question may be a tough one and maybe an unfair one, because it's kind of like asking a parent if they have a favorite child. But
Okay.
do you have a favorite character?
Favorite character in my books, or
Yes, your books.
in my books? I guess I would have to say Zach, the main character,
Okay.
because and also because the books are, I write in the third person, but very close. So you see for the whole book, you just follow Zach. So you learn what he learns, you learn what he learns at the same time. So the camera never kind of veers away from him. So he is sort of the main character, and I guess to spend that much time with the character, you kind of have to like them in a certain way. I mean, you could be writing real anti-heroes and not exactly like them, but you want to spend time with them. So I think Zach, and obviously his best friend Jags, because they sort of that humor element, they bounce off each other. But you know, other people have had a stranger sort of like favorite characters in the first book. Well, and in both books, there's a where Zach works. So he works for a builder's and he's a delivery driver. He just drops sort of building supplies at various sort of places where they're needed, so building sites and houses that are being renovated and stuff like that. And the company he works for, there's a warehouse supervisor called Sid, who's, you know, he's a full sort of from India. He has a really thick Indian accent, and he really mangles the English language, and he kind of sits in his office and lords it over everyone else that works there. And I think Zach and him have this kind of fractious relationship where Zach will really take, I was going to say take the mickey again, but I mean, you'll know what I mean now.
I know what you mean. Go right ahead.
So Zach will really sort of take the mickey out of him, and they trade insults, and you know, it's quite a, but he's quite a sort of, I guess, a Falstaffian character, to use as kind of Shakespearean kind of connection. And a lot of people have said they really find him, they love the scenes where Zach and Sid are interacting, because it's like they find them really funny, and they kind of warm to Sid, who I, you know, set out to make this quite sort of obnoxious and unlikable character, but people have kind of warmed to him. And in Stone Cold Trouble, in the second book, we're introduced to Zach's best friend Jags's uncle, who's called Lucky. Lucky by name, unfortunately not by nature. And he, you know, he has a lot of things sort of kind of going wrong for him, and the boys, the two main characters, are sort of helping him out with an issue that he has. And so he's in that book quite a lot, and a lot of people said, oh, they really liked him, he should have his own sort of book, which kind of struck me as kind of what, you know, I don't know that I could write a whole book about him, but I'm working on the third novel, and both Sid and Lucky will make appearances in that.
Good. That's good. Now, let's just step back a little and look at the publishing world overall.
Yeah.
How difficult is it for writers to get started today?
I think it's both very difficult and easier than it's ever been. And that sounds like a complete contradiction, but I think it's harder in that the sheer numbers of people now trying to get published is immense. I know, having talked to my agent, I think she was saying they get something like 200 to 300 manuscripts a week.
Wow.
And then they have to read those in their own time, in their spare time, just because they have client authors that they have to work with during the day. So they'll read on the train and stuff like that. So it takes a very long time to get through that many, and that's every week. They're coming in every week, and so that's sort of, if it's sort of like, if we say 250 a week, and then that's 1,000 a month, so that's 12,000 a year roughly. And out of that 12,000, my agent will only take on perhaps 2 or 3 new clients. So that just goes to show how tough it is out there. And I think a lot of agents are, similar. And I think a lot, some of that stems, people say, from the J.K. Rowling effect, because, she was a single parent and she wrote those books in a cafe while she was on benefits.
Yep.
And she went on, to achieve such global success. So people, I think, immediately when that story sort of came to light, they're thinking, wow, well, if she can do it, maybe I can give it a go. So lots of people are sort of aspiring to be that next big thing. But unfortunately, it takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to get to a point where you are publishable. And for a majority of authors, nothing like that. Job right on the side. I think that's the hard part. Easier is that there's a lot more publishers. You can publish yourself online. Ebooks are a way into publishing, and
Sorry. I'm sorry, you're breaking up a little on me, Amer.
Oh, sorry. I don't know. Is that any better?
That's good. Thank you.
Yeah. I think there's always an appetite for new authors. People are always looking for new authors, and I think sometimes what the big publishers do, if they're not sure about a book, they'll wait for it. If it's self-published, if it starts to do well, then they'll pick it up. So it's a kind of testing ground. So while it's easier for people to sort of self-publish and get into publishing and get published, to get a traditional deal, I still think is very difficult, just because of the sheer numbers of people attempting to do that.
No, you're right there. I meet writers who almost brag about how many rejection slips they have.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very unusual. I mean, I really did expect to have so many rejections before I got an agent, and it was just, I won that award, that got me an agent. I mean, that really sort of put me up the ladder a few rungs. So that was a real advantage, but it still was difficult to then get published, even after I'd written the book. So
yeah, sometimes it's just dumb luck. I have a client who's a writer, he's a New York Times bestselling author, James Heyman, and he started writing after he retired after a career working on Madison Avenue. He was like the kid that he was one of the original Mad Men, and he wrote his book, and he was invited to a conference somewhere to read, and he read the first chapter. Sitting in the audience was a woman, an agent, who represents some of the bigger mystery thriller writers at the time. She loved it, asked for more. Next thing he knew, a few weeks later, he had a contract. And Jim is very humble about it. He says, I know what so many authors have to go through and how many really good authors never get found, but it just fell into my lap. And there are stories like yours and his out there where, or the J.K. Rowling's, where you get lucky.
Well,
you're talented, but you get lucky.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, she eventually got lucky. Didn't J.K. Rowling had something like 130 or 150 rejections before a real small publisher. And
Scholastic.
I think in the UK it was Bloomsbury.
Yeah. Scholastic was in the US. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So, and they had just sort of set up, and she got such a tiny advance for that first book, and they just sort of took her on, and they didn't expect to sell many copies. So I think of that first hardback, there was only, I think, might be wrong, I think about 1,000 copies, if that, or a few hundred of the very first printing. And it wasn't till I think sort of book 2 or 3 that it suddenly just, went skyward.
I understand it's good copies of that first edition go for a small fortune when they're auctioned.
Yeah, they do. I think there's a printing mistake or something on the very first few hundred, and so those are the ones that are really rare and valuable.
Okay, good to know. I'll have to take a look at my to be read pile, see if it's in there.
Yeah, but for all I'm saying, it should not put anyone off. If they want to write, you should write your story, because just because it is very difficult, if your writing is good enough, it will be picked up.
Yeah, it's there's been so many changes in the publishing industry. You've got the consolidation of the major publishing houses. Over here in the US, I think we're down to 4, maybe 3 soon. I'm hearing anecdotally that agents are fewer, and I think you're right that the self-publishing route is the way many authors are going to go. The big publishing houses seem to be very leery about risk.
I was just thinking that, and I've said this before as well. They're very risk averse, and I think what I put that down to is that because they've all been consolidated by these massive companies and they have these big accounting departments, they just don't want to make a loss. And editors, whereas in the old days, and you hear about writers like loads of famous writers, and they say that it took them until their sort of like 6th or 7th book before they kind of gained traction and kind of made it anywhere. These days, you don't have that luxury. If your first book doesn't do well, you may not get a deal for your second book. Yep. It's that kind of tricky. And if back in the old days, your first few books could make a loss, and they'd be happy. They would say, we believe in you. We'll carry on. We'll try a few more. These days, that just won't happen. You have to, and I think you have to be seen to make money. And if you don't,
right?
Yeah, and if you don't, they'll cut you loose. And that has happened to authors that I know as well. That their publisher has just sort of cut them loose, even if they have a contract for like 3 books. If the first one doesn't do well, and they don't expect the others to do well, they'll just say, "Oh, thanks, but no thanks."
Yeah, I started reading mysteries seriously maybe about 30 years ago. And shortly after I started reading in the business press that many of the then publishing houses were cutting authors, several of whom, I used to enjoy their books, but for whatever reason, that culling started, back at the end of the last century. And, unless they think you're a sure thing, and, even many of the sure things, they really don't spend a lot of money promoting. As I talk to writers these days, they're expected to be out there aggressively promoting their own books. They're supposed to have an active social media presence. It's becoming a very metrics-oriented world for them. And some authors thrive in that, but many authors come from the school of, I'm going to write my book, give it to the publisher, and then I'm going to go write my next book.
And I think the rude awakening for a lot of authors, I've seen this as well on sort of social media, for sort of like debut authors, is that the publisher, when your book comes out, they will have like a 6-week window for your book, 2 weeks before, or 2 or 3 weeks before, 2 or 3 weeks after it comes out. Then they have to move on to the next book, and then you are left. Then it's down to you. What other promotion happens after that is really down to the author themselves. So, and a lot of first-time authors are just, they don't know what to do. They didn't expect that. They thought that the publisher would be there to sort of help them through, from day one when they're sort of published, and continue, that they would do all the promotion and stuff like that. But unfortunately, that's not how it works. And I think for myself, I've done a lot of reading and research around publishing. I've read so many author interviews and stuff. So I felt maybe I kind of knew what to expect a little more when I went into it.
Yeah, another phenomenon that's happening that's affecting writers is with many newspapers and magazines shutting down and the remaining ones cutting their review staffs. Like in this
Yeah,
country, I think the New York Times, based in New York, may be one of the last newspapers that has a full-time mystery reviewer on staff. Many others just farm it out to on a contract basis. Like, here's a couple of books, give us some reviews, and get back to us when you can. Unlike in the old days where there would be uh, regular reviewers for the major periodicals that people could turn to, maybe once a month, every couple of weeks, and
yeah,
that's gone, and makes it very difficult. Now, I know there are bloggers out there, several of whom have been on this broadcast, who are reviewing and they provide a valuable service,
certainly,
but
yes.
they don't make money out of it,
No,
and it's hard to it's finding it's harder and harder to see who's making money in the publishing world anymore, except the publishers.
yeah, well, yeah, and some big name authors, and I think you
Mhm.
really need some of the big name authors do continue to do well, but I
Yep.
think it's difficult to get up to that sort of level. There's so many people who like myself are working like primary jobs, and they write on the side because you
That's
just don't make enough money from writing. I mean,
No, that's very true. I mean, every author I've met has got a day job doing something else. Um, it's Yeah, I wonder, what publishing may look like in another 10, 20 years if we keep going the way we're going. Who knows? We'll probably have artificial intelligence writing the books by then. I don't know. Uh,
let's
but
hope
yeah,
not.
it's yeah, I'm with you. I hope not either. But I find it very worrisome what's going on. Amer, next question for you. What about your future projects? You've mentioned a third book where hopefully we're going to see Sid and Lucky in it. Um,
Yeah.
when that may come out, or when can we expect to see it?
Well, I think the whole thing about the pandemic and lockdown, my sort of creative process just sort of ground to a halt. So that really didn't help me. And also, so the first two books, Brothers in Blood and Stone Cold Trouble, were part of a two-book deal. And so with the second book, the deal was kind of done, and so I'm out of contract at the moment. But my publisher has expressed that they would like a third book in the series. Now, I sort of planned a standalone thriller, and it was all planned out and ready to write, which I thought was going to be book three for me. But they said they'd like a third, so I had to shelve that. And then the pandemic came along, and I sort of didn't do a great deal of writing. Like most people, I was sort of glued to the news and worried about what was going on everywhere. And then I had sort of come up with a completely sort of new story for book three, which is what I'm working on now, and I'm really sort of excited about the story, and it's going really well. And there's a lot of new characters being introduced. As to
Great.
when that'll be ready, I'm not quite sure. And then after that should be the standalone thriller, which again is set around the West London area, but this time it deals with an armed robbery that goes right and then goes terribly wrong. And then I
Look
have
forward to seeing
ideas,
them.
and then I have ideas for two books after that, but those happen to be historical thrillers.
Well, we'll look forward to seeing more of your books. You've mentioned the pandemic, and many of the guests who have been on our show since we started, and we were started to help writers during the pandemic, have talked about how it's affected their writing. Some have said, actually, it gave me more time to write. Others, like you, especially given the political situation in both our countries, have been kind of distracted by that, as well as all the other problems that seem to be going on in the world. And it certainly has affected the business side of publishing. Many conferences were canceled. I don't know if you're familiar with West Coast Crime, but that was actually underway in, I think it was April of 2020 on the West Coast, I think San Diego, and they shut it down like on the second day. They said, sorry, folks, we've got the lockdown across the country, and everybody was left to find their way home. But more events are starting to get scheduled. You had mentioned before that the broadcast began. You're going to be going, hopefully, to a writers' conference in a couple of weeks.
Yes, so well, actually, this week. So Harrogate is on Thursday. So the Theakston's Crime Writing Festival. It's probably one of the biggest in the UK, and so there'll be like loads of authors from both sides of the Atlantic there, and from further afield as well. So, and that's a great kind of summer festival. I've been going for a few years now, and I really enjoyed that. Just meeting the readers and other authors and stuff. It's great.
Wonderful. Will you be on any of the panels, or are you just going to go as a?
I'm
as
just
a
going
guest?
as a punter. I'm just going
Yep.
along with everyone else, just because I get to meet up with lots of authors that I know there, and it's great to hang out and stuff. I'm not on a panel because I don't have a book out this year, so
Ah, okay.
yeah, I'm not on a panel this year. And then in September, there's another big festival in London called Capital Crime, so I'll be going to that as well.
Good. Good. I hope you'll mention the mystery hour while you're out there meeting everybody.
I will indeed. I will indeed. And I should
Well,
just say,
I'm sorry.
sorry, if I could just sort of say quickly
Please.
that because my books they didn't get published in the US, but they are now distributed, both of them in the US. So like any bookstore that wants to will be able to order them, and so hopefully they'll be on the shelves in the sort of crime bookstores, the specialist stores, but just available over there for the first time.
Certainly do that. Are they available as ebooks in the U.S.?
I believe so. I'm not 100%, but I guess so. Through Amazon, it should be available, and yeah, and the paperbacks should be available in bookshops.
Oh, great. We'll look forward to that. Well, Amer, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. This has been a fabulous interview.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, please, we're happy to have you, and I want to thank Kelly Garrett again for recommending you to us, as well as all the other authors who have been with us. So we're going to be ending our sixth broadcast for 2022 right now, and I'd like to thank Amer and our audience for joining us. We're going to be back on Monday, August 15th for our next show. Please join us then when Nev March will be our guest. Nev has written a series of historical mysteries based on the British Raj, which should be very interesting. I know I'm looking forward to that.
Sounds great.
Our live broadcast is ending now. Please contact me at conpsweeney@someti.com if you have suggestions for panelists, ideas for shows, or wish to participate yourself. I'm learning that putting on a show like this isn't easy. So if you'd like to volunteer to help out our stage crew, let me know as well. Thank you again for joining, and see you again next month. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.